Now, I will say that Sherry provided me with this PowerPoint, so I don't agree with all of the necessarily all the memes in here.
Okay.
Java is wonderful, but it is not my personal favorite. It's a great language to learn, though. So if there are any discrepancies in here from what I say, everything on this PowerPoint is awesome and it's great. It's just phrased a little differently from some of the way that I'd put it.
And we'll be able to share this PowerPoint with you after the session. So.
Okay, so general overview of the exam. According to College Board, it's a really short one. 2 questions, one on ArrayLists or arrays, and another one on control structures and methods. Total time is about 50 minutes. And you'll be writing code and answering short answer questions. We'll look at the 2 practice questions that College Board released after this presentation. Just as a quick reminder, you don't have to worry about 2D arrays, inheritance, or recursion, which can be kind of nice.
Just
a quick note on.
You're good, go ahead.
Sherry?
Go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick note on the timing. Make sure you don't spend too much time on one part and make sure you pace yourself accordingly.
And the 2019, the question numbers, those are some good problems just to practice those question types specifically.
So back to Unit 1, very beginning of the semester. We've got primitive types, which are very simple data structures. They're stored pretty much in memory, and you access them completely by value and not by reference like you would with objects. You've got integers, doubles, booleans, and be aware of integer division. That's always something that can easily trip you up when you're writing a problem. When you're dividing 2 integers, it will always return an integer. If you have a double in there somewhere, it will return a double instead. Integer division can be extraordinarily helpful, especially in conjunction with the modulus operator, which is that % sign. You've got your incrementers and decrementers here, with the plus plus and minus minus. Plus plus adds, minus minus subtracts by 1. Plus equals will add to the value of the variable that's already there. So if you've got a variable that's 4 and you do plus equals 2, the variable will now be 6. Same general idea with star equals, slash equals, and minus equals. A couple extra things when you're declaring a variable. Final creates a constant. So if you have something that's not going to change through the program, you can declare it as final. You probably won't need to do that on the exam, but it's a good thing to remember. With casting, you put the data type that you want to cast to in parentheses before the value that you're trying to cast. Remember that when you're casting to an integer, it truncates it. It just gets rid of all of the decimals after it from a double. Here's the formula for a random number. It's good to remember because it can be difficult sometimes to remember exactly what it should look like. But there it is for your reference. Okay, so for objects, you've got the first main part about objects when you're calling them is that you have to instantiate them first. A lot of the time, unless you're only using static methods, which we'll cover later. But when you want to instantiate an object, you do type, variable name equals new type, and then in parentheses you have your arguments for the constructor. I'll show you an example of this after the presentation when I go into a little bit of a hands-on example with some actual code. Some string methods worth remembering are substring, index of, length, and obviously, this isn't quite a string method, but printing is a very good thing to remember. Remember, it's system.out.print. With substring, a small thing to keep in mind is that it's from the first number up into, but not including the last number. And index of returns the first occurrence of the character that you're looking for. So in your free response questions, when you're given a method header, make sure you're aware of the return type. We'll look at that further when we go over the free response questions that were provided. But return type and parameters and the types of parameters are important when you're thinking about how your method's going to work. Void, of course, means that nothing will need to be returned. Strings are immutable objects, which means that after they're created, they cannot be changed. You can copy a string into another string if you want to make a change, but you can't change the actual string itself. And null is an empty object with no type. Booleans and if statements. So these are your control structures things. So you've got your comparisons, equals equals. Remember, it's two equals for comparing. And this is a strict equals. So don't use it for comparing objects unless you want to check if something is, if two variables are pointing to the same location in memory. So these are going to compare either true or false. You can also use them to compare the content of variables or the output of methods. Keywords to know that you're going to be expected to use these are comparison words. At least, so greater than or equal to, more than, greater than, less than, or at most. When you're doing logical ands or ors, remember that it's two ampersands for a logical and two pipes for a logical or. Not is a bang or exclamation point. So we've got general formatting for if statements, else ifs, and else. Remember that you have to have a condition for ifs and else if, but you will not have a condition for else. That's your last case. When comparing objects like strings, you'll want to use dot equals to make sure that you're comparing, that you're using the object's implementation of the dot equals method and comparing them the way that the objects wanted you to compare them. When evaluating Boolean expressions, and takes precedence over or. And one thing that will almost certainly be on the exam, but it's good to know, is De Morgan's law, which talks about the equivalence of Boolean expressions. When you have a not outside of a comparison, or a not outside of ands, you flip that to not A or B. So not A and B in parentheses turns to not A or B. Similarly, not A or B would translate to not A and not B. Oh, by the way, these two are the same thing. If you're good at Googling, it makes you a much better programmer. You might not realize it now, but Googling is a very large part of programming.
It also helps to be good at grammar, which that person is not.
Yeah. I noticed that, and I'm just trying to block it out because it's bugging me a bit. But good at programming is made easier by good at Googling. So general loops, the two that you're probably going to be the two that you're most likely going to see on the exam, I think would be the standard for loop or the for each loop, the enhanced for loop. Just remember the parts of the for loop. You've got your incrementer that, well, you've got your variable that you're going to track where you are in the loop. You've got your condition, and then you have what happens after the loop. So in this case, you increment I, which is the most common one. Remember, with things like word.length, if you're accessing, well, we'll talk about, I'll come back to that in a minute. Sorry. For each loop, so numbers is going to be some kind of collection, and this will go through each item in the collection and do something with it inside the loop. So if you need to access a specific element of an array or something, for loops can be very helpful, especially if you're doing things that are next to each other. An enhanced loop would be if you just want to look at each one individually. While loops, and similarly do whiles, execute as long as the condition is true. Do whiles will always execute the first time and then check the condition. Very similar syntax. With arrays and ArrayLists out of bounds exceptions, you always, when you're getting the size or length of an array or ArrayList, you always want to make sure that you're doing less than that. Because arrays and ArrayLists, we start counting at 0 in programming. So if you just use the whole size, you'll probably get an index out of bounds exception. And if you do less than, up until you're less than the size, you'll stay in bounds most of the time. Break, this can be used to short circuit a loop. So if you've got something that's running and if you hit a condition and you want to get out of the loop, when you hit that condition, a break statement will do that. You should not need it on the exam though.
And just to clarify, when you want to use a for loop is when you want to access like I, the number in your code. So when you're like in your ArrayList question, when you're looking for which loop you want to use, you have to know whether you need that number I or not.
Mm-hmm. So for classes, to start with a class, you're always going to want to start by creating all of your instance variables. You won't, I don't believe you'll have to create a class on the exam, but when you start creating a class, the first thing would usually be the instance variables, followed by your constructors. There are two main types of constructors. You've got your default constructor, which takes no arguments, and you've got a complete constructor. If you only want a default constructor, Java will create one that sets all of your instance variables to the default value, which is for integers 1, for strings null, and stuff like that. So getters and setters, those are usually used to interact with your instance variables. These you'll usually see get variable name or set variable name. Getters will always have a return type of null. I mean, getters will always have a return type that's the same as the variable that they're getting and shouldn't have any parameters. Setters will have a return type of null, or void rather, and will take as a parameter the value that you need to change. With access modifiers, public and private are the two that you'll need to know for the exam. Public means that any class that wants to use it can use it. Private is for things that are just going to stay inside the class. There are also access modifiers like protected, which would mean that you can use it inside the class and any class that inherits from it. but public and private is all that you will most likely need for the exam. With instance variables, you're going to almost always want to set those to private. Methods, for the most part, are going to be public, unless you have a helper method that's only purpose is to do work for another method in the class. Those would be private. Another modifier for methods is the static keyword. This is used, you see this a lot in the math class. So when you use the math class, you don't have to create a math object. You can call math.pow, or in the random number example earlier, we had the math.random. This tells us that random is a static method because we didn't have to create a math object. And as it says, these are called by class name dot method name.
Do you mind explaining exactly what static is? Like, what does it do compared to a public and a private class, or public and private method?
So static methods will also have a public or private modifier. They're almost always public, but a static method can only do stuff, can only create, it can only change, its output is only based off of the inputs, on the parameters that are input. So there are no instance variables that it's keeping track of.
I think a helpful way to look at it is like static methods. All the objects of that class are going to have the same static variable and the same static method. But for like instance variables, they're each going to have their own value, but they're all going to share whatever static variables are in that class. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
That's a very good explanation of static variables.
With a static variable, if you manipulate the static variable from another class, does that value hold true every time you access it, therefore on, or does it reset back to its original value?
So after a static variable is set up, if you change it at all, while you're still in the same program, it will stay constant throughout that program.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's not instance specific. So with an abstract, so like a static method, an abstract method is a special type of method. You will only really see, you should only see these in abstract classes or in interfaces, which you don't have to worry about implementing on this exam. So an abstract method is not something that can be called. When you're implementing a class that has an abstract method in it, you have to provide implementation before Java will let you compile it. Because it's mostly saying, here's a method that can exist, but we don't know what it does yet. You need to tell us what it does. This keyword, so when you're saying this dot something, it's very useful in constructors when you have a parameter that's the same as an instance variable. So if you want to access the instance variable, you have to use this dot, but if you just want the parameter, it would be the name of the parameter. So if you have a class that has an instance variable name, but the constructor also has name as the parameter that it's passed, you would do this dot name equals name to have it update correctly. Super is another thing that you won't have to worry about on the exam, but it is used to call the implementation of a class from the parent. This is used in polymorphism when you have a parent and a child that have different implementations of the same class, of the same method. And then remember, when you're writing class methods, if you have a return statement in there, nothing will be executed past where that return statement is. If that return statement is executed, it breaks out of the method and execution returns to the calling function. arrays. So these are a type of collection, a very basic collection. They can hold primitives or objects. The syntax for declaring one is on that second bullet. It's also worth saying that if you want to fill an array at the same time that you're declaring it, between that final closing bracket and the semicolon, you can have curly braces that have your values inside it. But that's not something that is necessarily best practice, and it's better just to fill the array after it's been declared and initialized. So objects are going to be stored at index I, and you can get that with this accessing syntax. Remember again, arrays start indexing at 0. So the first one will be 0, and the second one will be at index 1. A little confusing, but once you get your head around it, it'll be second nature. So the length of an array is immutable. You can't change the length of an array. You can put a new array in the same space that's a different size, but you have to create a brand new array and reallocate the memory for it. And then when you're using an array in a method, do whatever you can to not change the original array. If you do that, you could mess up, because arrays are passed by reference. So if you change the objects in that initial array, you could change them for the whole program, which might not be intended functionality.
One quick note about the length, calling the length an array. For the strings, you need the parentheses to call the length method in the string class. But for the array, you do not need the parentheses. Otherwise, you'll get a syntax error.
Yep. Length is a property of arrays. It is not a function. ArrayLists. This is a big one. It's a different kind of collection, and it can only hold objects. If you need to hold something like an integer, you can always use your wrapper classes, which for int is going to be integer with a capital I. And and all of the primitive types have wrapper classes. Unlike arrays, the length is mutable. It dynamically allocates, well, it kind of dynamically allocates memory. The way it does it is not important for this test. But the length can be changed, and items can be added to the array list after it's created. So if you have a list that you don't know the length of when it's created, an array list is a good choice. To use it fully, you have to import it. So here's a reminder of the import statement.
For this test, do we need to import it in our code, or is it automatically imported for us?
No, I don't think so.
You should not have to.
Okay.
The instructions usually say that all necessary imports have been done. Everything that's on the reference sheet has been imported for you.
Okay.
So you should not have to worry about that. Good question.
All right, thank you.
So declaration and instantiation right here, and a couple reminders of ArrayList methods. Remember that the function size is how you get the size of an array list. So for strings, it's length with parentheses. With an array, it's length, no parentheses. And for an array list, it's size with parentheses. Okay, so while you're taking the exam, make sure to read the question carefully. Take the first few minutes to really understand what it's asking you. Then start thinking through the steps that you're going to take. What loop you're going to use, what variables do you need, how is your function going to terminate, stuff like that. Surprisingly to me, and I read the AP guidelines 2 or 3 times just to make sure I was reading it right, you guys can use an IDE on this exam. Whatever you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to be Replit. That's a great one. It can be whatever you used for the class or whatever you are comfortable with. That's really helpful. You can do the whole solution in there, or you can just use it to figure out a few things here and there. Always make sure to check your work. Look at all of the cases that you've been given by College Board and make sure that your function does what you think it should do based on those cases. The actual way that your code is written out isn't as important. The important things are method names, class names, and the logic and the order that you put them in. Extra things like semicolons, brackets, and parentheses are not going to lose you many points. The logic is the big thing the College Board is interested in. And for the paragraph responses, identify, which is just state what it is. State the very bare minimum to say what it is, what you need, and then describe how it works. And it has instructions on the example problems for exactly what identifying and describing look like. And if you're given, be careful with the instructions. If it tells you about something, there's probably a reason it's there. Use everything that the problem gives you. Now, here are a couple links. You'll have this PowerPoint after the presentation, so you'll be able to access these links. So you don't need to write them down now. But there are a couple really helpful things. The sample questions that we'll go over. Past FRQs. Not all of them are applicable to this class this year, but they're really good practice anyways. Coding Bat is a really great way to get some practice with Java. They've got lots of awesome activities. And then if you feel like you want to prepare yourself some more, go ahead and write out some of the methods that are commonly used. Review the scoring guidelines on College Board. That can be helpful. And look over this again. Also linked here is the College Board exam site if you have any questions pertaining directly to that. But what can I answer for you?
I guess the one thing I've been kind of confused on with this new exam or the open-ended questions, because I looked at some examples and they still didn't really make sense to me personally. And I was wondering if you could go over some of the open-ended questions, how you'd recommend solving them, because there aren't any rubrics I could find that explained how exactly like they're going to be grading them versus like the FRQs where they usually have some older rubrics that you can actually look through.
Yeah, so we will, in a couple minutes here, we will look at these two practice problems, which include open-ended questions, and I'll give you my general solutions for them. Also, remember at the bottom of this page, it talks about what they're looking for in these problems and explains exactly what identifying and describing looks like. But yes, I will go over what my interpretation of how these should be answered. Any other questions before we jump into looking at these problems?
Feel free to type it in the chat whenever one pops in your head too.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to NetBeans, which I expect is an IDE that you guys likely used. I don't know exactly what everybody's used, but NetBeans is a fairly popular one. And so this is something that you can do when you're taking the exam to make sure you've got your syntax right and everything like that. So I'm just creating a new project. It gives me this example file. But if we go back to College Board, we see that the class is called Gizmo. So I'm going to create a new file called Gizmo so I can run it if I'd like to. Okay. What is meant by iterative statements? Yeah, those are loops. Okay. So I'm going to try to make this as interactive as I can. In the problem, we're told in part A.
Oh, we can take a couple minutes just so everyone can like read the question and figure out what it's talking about.
So I'm going to put the link to this in the chat window so everybody can pull it up, because it's kind of hard to read with me scrolling constantly. But the overall setup of this question is you've got a Gizmo class and an online purchase manager class. I'll give you guys about 2 or 3 minutes to just read through this question 1, and then we can start talking about how we're going to solve it. Okay, I hope everybody's had a chance to read through the whole thing, or at least gotten through A at this point. So when we're looking at A, we're asked to do a couple things. The main idea is to count the electronics based on a maker that we're passed. So we're given a string maker, and we're asked to return an integer. So we've got an array list called purchases as a instance variable in the class, and we're going to have to iterate through it somehow. Based on what we've been given so far, what do you guys think is the best way to iterate through this? Are we going to use a for loop, an enhanced for loop, a while loop? Which one?
Maybe a for each loop.
An enhanced for loop? Yeah, that's what I chose as well, because we just need to know something about the objects. We don't need to know where they are in the list. We just want to go through all of them. So to start out, I need to get the other file. This one's called online purchase manager. Okay. So we've got purchases, and now we want to implement count electronics by maker. And so we're going to start with a for loop through each type of gizmo in purchases. And what do we want to do in this for each loop? You can either put it in chat or just talk. So we're given a condition that we have to satisfy. We want to count the number of electronics by maker. So to me, that sounds like an if statement. We want to check if some conditions are true. So we have this, and we can get the maker of the gizmo and check if it equals the maker that's been given to us. But we also want to check something else. If we just count things that are makers, we might get some things that aren't electronics. So I need to remember what this is called. I think it's electronic, yep. So I don't have to compare anything here because this returns a Boolean, either true or false. And then we're using dot equals because we're comparing strings to compare makers. So if both of them are true, true and true is true. And so we need to do something in the if statement. What is that going to be? Well, we want some way to keep track of how many we find that satisfy both of these conditions. So we're going to need a count, and we're going to need to increment it. But we haven't created a count yet. So we're going to declare and initialize a count variable. And now, once we've gotten how many there are, we just need to return how many we found. Okay, are there any questions with what I've written so far? Okay. And if I'm going too fast or anything, just tell me to slow down and I will. So now we're going to move on to part B. This one talks about an adjacent equal pair. So we want to check if they're two of the same objects next to each other. This is going to be another iteration thing. What kind of loop should we use for this application? So since we're looking at adjacent objects, things that are next to each other in the list, I think it makes sense to use a regular for loop. So we can use indices to check if the two adjacent things are the same. So we're going to start for okay. So are there any issues with what I've written so far? there is an issue with something that I've written so far. If somebody sees what it is, go ahead and stop me. If not, I'm going to keep going and we'll figure it out soon. Okay. So now that we're going through each one, we need to check if each object is next to the same object. How are we going to do that? Well, this is obviously going to be a condition. And we want to check if one purchase at index I is equal to another purchase that happens to be next to it. So if we find two purchases that are the same, it asks us to return true. So if it happens that two of them that are next to each other are the same, we return true. If we get to the end of the list and, oh, thank you. If we get to the end of the list and we haven't found any two that are the same that are next to each other, we return false. So if this program is run, it will always throw an error. There are two reasons for that. Well, mainly just one. One of these is in the instructions. So when you read the instructions you want to read the instructions closely because you might find something like this. So if purchases has less than 2 elements, return false. We can put that into our method by adding an if purchases.size is less than 2. Return false. But does anybody see the other error that's in here?
Yeah, I is less than purchases.size should be I is less than purchases.size minus 1, right?
And why is that?
Because with the if statement under there, it goes to if purchases at I dot equals purchases I plus 1. If you have that with the original code, then it's going to throw an array out of bounds exception.
Yep, every single time. That's something you've got to watch out for when messing with arrays. So while less than size is usually good, if you're also checking the next element, you have to make sure it's size minus 1. What did that not like? Oh, there's another very big error in here that nobody called me on. This is an array list. How do we access array lists?
Isn't it dot length?
No, this is correct.
Oh, wait. Yeah, never mind.
There's something incorrect right here. Exactly.
Dot get.
Yep. I treated this like an array instead of an array list. And I promise it was completely intentional, just for the teachable moment. That's definitely why I did it. So yeah, since we're doing this in an IDE, it caught the error and told me, you're not doing something that makes sense. So that's a big bonus that you guys get for being able to use the IDE. And I'd recommend that you take advantage of that. Because you could also run this and create a main method to test it. But for the sake of time, let's look at the next question, part C.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
I know you can run it, but how would you be able to run it for, I know, because for a couple of the questions in the FRQs, sometimes a Gizmo class will have a method that says like implementation not defined or not shown. Then how do you run something like that since you don't have any way, it doesn't have an actual code inside of it?
Yeah, so what you'd have to do is implement it.
Okay.
When I was working this out to make sure that it works, I implemented the methods that was necessary. So I created a Boolean that I could return in the electronic method. I implemented the equals method to say if these two are exactly equal, return true. And then you can write, I don't think I actually wrote a main method to test this, but you could write a main method and put in the array list with the Gizmo objects.
Do you recommend we do that on our tests when we're taking the test? Do you recommend we do the implementation and run our code?
Only if you have a lot of extra time.
Okay.
Chances are you won't, but if you do and you're worried about if something works or not, that is an option.
I think even if you don't run your code, your IDE will catch a lot of like silly mistakes you might make, such as it did with the array list. So I would still recommend typing it out in an IDE. Running it might take a long time.
Yep.
Is IntelliJ a suitable IDE for this?
Yeah, it's very overkill, actually, but
Okay.
it would work.
All right.
My personal favorite is VS Code. I'm using NetBeans right now because I know that that is an IDE that's commonly used in teaching Java.
I have a question. So I tried to use VS Code and I also tried to use like BlueJ and stuff like that. But I keep getting an error saying that like it says Java home environment variable and then it gives an address, does not point to a JDK, but I downloaded it off the internet and it's still not working.
So I can help you fix that. Afterwards, I'll tell you a way that you can get in contact me and I'll walk you through how to troubleshoot that. But it's going to take longer than a few seconds.
Okay. Thank you.
So let's look at question C really quickly. This is one of those open-ended free response questions. So it asks you to write a method header for this new method, tell what needs to be changed, and to identify any changes, and then describe the changes that need to be made. So I would recommend that you guys, let's take about 3 minutes for you guys to write out what you think an answer that you'd give. And then I'll show you what mine was.
You can submit your responses in the chat if you want.
Or just keep them to yourself. Okay. I know that probably wasn't enough time to get completely finished, but running up on that hour mark. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep going. So what Maddie submitted looks really good. One thing that I'd recommend that, oh, yeah, no, never mind. You included it, I just didn't read it. Yours looks really good. Hopefully mine looks as good as yours did, because I don't remember mine. So let me share this. So for mine, I've got, this was my method header. It's a public method that's returning a gizmo and accepts a string for the maker. So you need to create a new price variable and an accessor for it, potentially a mutator. Not necessarily necessary. I also stipulated that it would have to be included in the constructor for gizmo. Now that I said that what there needs to be, I've stated that the price variable would need to be a double. This is me going to describing. So this first part was stating, and this next part is describing. The accessor would be public. Default constructor would initialize price to a default value, possibly 0. And the parameter, oh, this is, in the complete constructor, you'd have to include a new parameter and we need to be initialized. Mutator would be a public void method and would set the price. Let me review what this said. And in the instructions, it stipulates that you do not need to describe the get cheapest gizmo method. So don't do any work that it doesn't ask for if you don't need to. So I hope that this is a pretty complete answer for what it's looking for. And I'll go ahead and put this in the chat window if there are people who haven't had a chance to finish looking at it. For the sake of time, we're going to go through question 2 really quickly. So usually you would take a couple minutes to just really thoroughly read this, but I'll summarize it quickly. So you've got a method, a class check digit that has a get check method, which we don't have to deal with, but we have to use, and a num with check digit method, or rather the is valid method, which returns a Boolean. Num with check digit is going to be a integer that has a number, first few digits for the number, and then the last digit is going to be your check digit. So as you can see in this table, I am sharing the right screen, right? Nope, I'm not. So in this table, you first call a check, the get check on the everything but the last digit to see the return value. And then you compare that return value to the last digit. If they're the same, you return true. If they're different, you return false. So this is just an algorithm one. This is not an iterator or anything. This particular question tests your knowledge with the modulus and integer division. Does anybody have any ideas about how you would start to solve this?
I solved this one already, but I ended up using a completely different way of doing it, which I realize is not super efficient, but I think it works. Is I converted my integer to a string, which I substringed, and then inside of my if statement, I just did integer.parseInt of that substring and compared the two integers.
Did you pass the value to check digit as an integer or as a string?
Yes, as an integer.
Okay, then that would work. What I'm going to show is without any casting. So the great thing about integer division is that it allows you to get the last digit really easily and to get, so any number divided by 10 will give you, did I do this wrong? No. Any number divided by 10 will give you everything after the first digit. So if it's, so this, if we pass it 1592, it'll give us 159 when we divide 1592 by 10. So we're passing 159 to check digit, or to get check. We're storing that check, and then we're using the modulus operator with our original 1592, except we're doing modulus 10, which gives us the last digit. So since the division, the remainder of divided by 10 is going to be 2 here, and dividing by 10 will give us everything but that first digit here. That was a terrible explanation. Does anybody have any clarifying questions? Okay. Then we will move on to the next part of this question. I realize that it's just about 2 o'clock, and if anybody needs to leave, feel free to. My feelings will not be terribly hurt, but I'm going to go ahead and finish this question. So this one is asking us to change check digit so that we keep track of how many times it returns false. So remember, identify and then describe. In my solution here, I first state that if we want to keep track of the number of false calls, you have to have a static integer. This is going to be whole class and doesn't change based on instantiation. And I called it times failed. In the, you also want to create an accessor just so you can look at what times failed is. You probably don't have to include the part about the accessor or the mutator, but I did it for the sake of completeness. And then I went on to describe how I would change the isValid method. I start by saying that we would have to move this condition that is returned into an if statement and check instead of if it's equal, if it's not equal. In the case that it's not equal, you increment times failed and then return false. If they are equal, it skips the if statement and just returns true. Any questions? Any questions about the AP exam in general?
Yeah, is there any chance that they're gonna make us do like nested for loops?
It's a possibility for question 1. There's nothing saying that they can't do a nested for loop. But what they won't be able to do is, why I find it unlikely there will be a nested for loop is because there are going to be no 2D arrays. And nested for loops are most often used for 2D arrays. So I think it's unlikely, but it is technically possible. Anything else? Any general tips for the exam? Sleep the night before, log on 10 minutes early, make sure you've got your exam checklist done, have your IDE open, have a project already created if you need to, and just take a deep breath first. You've got this. You've had this the whole year to prepare.
Make sure you pace yourself throughout the exam, as I said earlier, and make sure your code is efficient. Don't write 2 pages of code.
And you probably won't have time for that because these are 2 questions that have separate timers. A 30-minute question, well, 25 plus 5 minutes to submit, and 10 plus 5 minutes to submit, if I remember correctly. Let's see. So the first one's 20 with 5 minutes to submit, and 10 with 5 minutes to submit. I would recommend also checking out this last link on the PowerPoint, which takes you to this page. It's got reminders about time, general reminders about the exam. It covers pretty much everything that I just said and gives you details on the 2 free response questions.
And I would say if you have absolutely no idea what to do with a problem, like at least write something. If you know that you're iterating through the array, iterate through the array even though you have no idea what you're doing with the elements. So just like put something.
Yeah, and if you can't remember what the actual code is for something, go ahead and write pseudocode. If you show the grader that you are thinking through it properly or thinking through it at all, they could give you points for that. It is definitely better to write full proper code, but if you can't come up with what that is, at the very least, write out some pseudocode.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you for coming, everyone. I know a lot of y'all aren't actually involved with peer-to-peer organizations, so after this, I'll send out